And Tim, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me do a reprise on this land too, so that I could finish what I intended to finish. And there will be some repeats of slides, but not very many, and a fair amount of new information on this. But we're talking about the purposes of land acknowledgement and why we would even want to be doing land acknowledgements. And you notice that Reverend Connie is doing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our services. It's very short, but it serves a purpose. One more. And a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that, first of all, recognizes and respects indigenous peoples as the original claimants and stewards of this land. It recognizes the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional lands. Thirdly, here we go. Thirdly, it recognizes that we're only the most recent inhabitants to occupy and lay claim to this land. And finally, and because of these facts, we have a stewardship responsibility for this land that must honor both the present and the past. And I think that's important for us to recognize that when we understand history, we understand our present better, and we also understand where our future is going to be. So why a UU land acknowledgement? Well, first of all, I think it's a spiritual practice for us as UUs that we should be giving honor to the people who occupied this land before us. Secondly, it's important to recognize that we're connected to those who have lived here before us. Third, it's important to understand our connection to the geography in which we live. We so often are disconnected from our geography that we don't have a sense of place anymore, because we can stay in our rooms and be on our computers and not have an inkling of what our geography is and how that is impacting us. It's also important to recognize that collectively we have a very complicated history. Things in our history are not as pleasant as we would want them to be. And there are some things in our history that are absolutely stellar and that we can draw inspiration from. And we need to recognize both of those things because that's what our history is. And lastly, because we're an arrogant people, we have bought into the mythology of hyper-individualism. A UU land acknowledgement helps remind us that we are not self-made people or a self-made culture. There were people before us and we stand on the shoulders of those people. So what's the dilemma of settler colonialism? And I want to define colonialism real quickly because that's important. Colonialism is that is the military, political, and social control of one people over another. It's the basis for European expansion to the rest of the world, that by 1885, the countries of Europe controlled over 85% of the world through a colonial domination. And there were two types of colonialism. One was settler colonialism and the other was extractive colonialism. Extractive colonialism was just going onto a land, taking control of it and stealing the natural resources. Settler colonialism was taking control of the land for the purposes of settling a population of people there so that they could start something new. And so the dilemma of settler colonialism is, what do you do with the people who are already occupying that space? Well, one choice would be mutual coexistence and incorporating those people into your culture and trying to figure out a way to live beside each other, even though you are controlling them. That's sort of what William Penn tried to do with his relationship to the Delaware and to the Shawnee in Pennsylvania, as well as the Moravians and a number of other tribal entities that were in eastern Pennsylvania. And he left a good legacy because many of those people, as they moved further west, because they were forced by other folks, had fond memories of what William Penn was able to accomplish by trying to have a mutual coexistence. But the other response, another response is subordinate or enslave that existing population. And that, unfortunately, was the choice that most settler colonialists make. They either subordinate the indigenous population or they try to enslave them. And that's precisely what we did in the early settlements in Virginia. Jamestown was built on the premise that they were going to enslave the indigenous population and they weren't going to have to work. And that was one of the problems that John Smith had in Jamestown, was that he couldn't get anybody to work because they went there to be slave masters. But the existing population, the indigenous people, didn't want to have anything to do with being enslaved, and they were able to run away or able to escape enslavement in many ways possible. Also, they were dying from disease contamination from the Europeans. So the enslavement was not really a good possibility. Subordination was still an option. Another option is to marginalize and or remove those people. Subordinating people is marginalizing them, and then pushing them further west is the other solution, to move them further west out of the way so that you could take over their land. A fourth option was to exterminate. And unfortunately, numbers 2 through 3 or through 4 were the choices that we ended up using most often. And then finally is to deny their existence and their history, particularly after you've decimated the population to the point that they're not a major factor in your life. And so you deny that they even had a history or that they were even ever very important at all. And so these are the answers to that dilemma that settler colonists faced. And if you remember, in the last session, I talked about the 6 grandfathers, which was a sacred Lakota mountain in South Dakota. Well, one of the ways that settler colonialism works is to erase the history of the previous occupants of the land. So the 6 grandfathers became a sacred mountain for the Americans. And that's why we built Mount Rushmore on a sacred space that was once controlled by the Lakota, to erase their history, to erase their existence, and to proclaim that this was a sacred mountain honoring some of our leaders. So that brings us to Cincinnati. Now, this is a portrait of Cincinnati at about 1800. The city is essentially 11 years old, but notice what's behind the town. The residents of Cincinnati have been here since 1789. And at this point, they have coexisted with mounds and ceremonial circles and ceremonial conical mounds that were there on the plain behind them. The town hadn't expanded far enough to do much interacting with that. And so they sort of coexisted, but it was sort of a backdrop. Now, little did they know that the caretakers of this territory were the Shawnee. The Shawnee had originally thought of this ground as their ground, and that they were caretakers of their ancient ancestors who had built these mounds. Okay. And so they took great offense to the fact that there was going to be a settlement on sacred ground that they were responsible for taking care of. So this is a statement from William Henry Harrison in 1837. And I'll read it for those of you who can't read it because you're on a phone or something. When I first saw the upper plain on which that city stands, it was literally covered with low lines of embankments. I had the honor to attend General Wayne 2 years afterwards in an excursion to examine them. We employed we were employed a greater part of the day in August 1793 in doing so. The number and variety of the figures in which these lines were drawn was almost endless, and as I have said, almost covered the plain. Unfortunately, Harrison didn't understand. I just spilled some water, so hang on just a second here. Unfortunately, Harrison didn't understand, and I'll go back up. He didn't connect the mounds he saw in 1793 with the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, or the Wyandot people he was assigned to remove from the Ohio Territory. Thank you. So the early settlers didn't recognize a lot about what was going on in the world that they had occupied. They had actually accepted the fact that these pristine forests that were well manicured by the indigenous people were the way that they naturally occurred. But if anybody's read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, The Indigenous History of North America or the United States, you find out that those lands and those forests were manicured meticulously by the indigenous populations, and the undergrowth was kept to a minimum so that people could travel in these great forests of the eastern woodlands. And these great forests were amazing monuments in themselves. Many of the early missionaries who traveled this land likened those forests to the cathedrals of Europe, because they felt like they were walking through natural cathedrals. And they never realized that it was the indigenous people who were keeping those woodlands in that pristine condition. So they didn't recognize that there was any connection between the mounds that they found and the pristine condition of the land that they'd found when they landed in North America. And they were lamenting the fact that there was nothing visible to them of a great past, like Egypt had in its pyramids, or England had of her Stonehenge, or Greece, the Acropolis. So they failed to find those traces of the awesome antiquity of that on which you could build a romantic myth. Well, in 1840, this tablet was discovered in that great mound in Cincinnati. And thus begins a realization that these were sophisticated people of a great civilization who had built these mounds. In fact, they'd found more of these kinds of tablets. The Cincinnati tablets on the left, the Meigs tablet is in the middle, and the Wilmington tablet is on the right. No one's quite sure what they were used for, even today. The Cincinnati tablet is held at the Cincinnati Museum Center, but it's not put on display at all for anybody to see, because out of respect for the ancients, and also because it would be highly controversial if the Museum Center would display it, because it would be an example of white supremacy, of white people owning these artifacts. But they also discovered all over the place that there were these mounds populating all over southern Ohio that gave great indication of a sophisticated civilization that existed sometime before them. They did not connect these to the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Miami, or any of the other tribes that were occupying Ohio. This mound city is located in Chillicothe, which was a Shawnee town, and the Shawnee were the guardians again of these mounds. Mound City is now part of the National Park System, and it's just right outside the city of Chillicothe. The name Chillicothe itself is a Shawnee name, Chalgotha, and it was anglicized to be pronounced Chillicothe. Likewise, there was a similar kind of crescent mound that was found in downtown Cincinnati outside of Chillicothe, and it was Ohio's own version of a Stonehenge. A henge is actually an earthwork that's circular in form with stone monuments on it. And of course, we had our Great Serpent Mound, which was located east of Cincinnati, about 65 miles. And we also had our own Serpent Mound here in Marymount. This was the outline of the Serpent Mound along the Little Miami River in Marymount, and was only discovered in the 20th century. But it has been dated to actually be contemporaneous with the Serpent Mound in Adams County. And then in 1848, settlers had discovered the mound earthworks of Milford. And this is an outline over the existing city of Milford today, showing you what they discovered in 1848. Now, most of this was obliterated because of city development, but at least Squire and Davis, who were the archaeologists or the people who uncovered this, they did some mapping and they tried to preserve it for the historic record. This, by the way, is only a mile or so away from the Marymount Serpent. And in between those two is the Turner Group of earthworks, which is located in Anderson Township, not very far from Meredith's home church, the Heritage Universalist Unitarian Church. And this was a mammoth earthwork that was right along the Little Miami River between Newtown and Marymount. So because of these discoveries, there was born a legend that dominated American imagination throughout the 19th century. And it was the myth of the mound builders. They said that the mound builders were a lost race of gifted artisans and creative people who passed, and they were ultimately exterminated by the treacherous, ignorant redskin savages who even now were causing so much trouble for the Christian settlers of the New World. So they even turned the historic evidence that proved that there must have been some kind of connection between the people they ran into in their time with the ancients. They decided to claim that it was a lost civilization that was destroyed by the people that are currently there, therefore making it easier to demonize the indigenous people of North America. And that's part of the process of settler colonialism ideology, that you try to take that stuff and you manipulate it into a worldview that will help you carry out your mission of dominating a culture and dominating a land. When nothing was further from the truth, you can see here that there are over 70 different archaeological sites in Ohio alone. And there are only 88 counties. And you've got three different times of civilization. You have the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Fort Ancient. And all of the archaeological sites that I've shown you pictures of come primarily from the Adena and the Hopewell, and only a couple of them date from the Fort Ancient time period. The Adena being the oldest, going back possibly 3,000 years to 1000 BC or BCE, and the Hopewell picking up right after the turn of the Common Era and going up to the year 1000. And the Fort Ancient culture, which is named after the Fort Ancient earthworks in Oregonia, Ohio, just north of us. They existed up until about the 1200s or 1300s. But the people that stayed in the Ohio Valley were their ancestors. And those included the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Miami. All of those people took the traditions from these cultures and still incorporated them into their own traditions. And one of the ways that we know it is that they knew what to do with some of these archaeological finds. They knew the ceremonies that went with these archaeological relics. Now, the Hopewell which was the largest group and lasted the longest period of time, had an extensive complex stretching all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And again, this tied the Hopewell into the cultures of the Seminole and the Choctaw and the Cherokee, and as well as the indigenous people of the Ohio River Valley. And it also stretched all the way up into Canada. And that was because of the great waterways of the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, that all of this could take place, because that was the major transportation for these cultures. And it still was for the indigenous people that greeted the Europeans when they arrived on the shores of the East Coast. So let's go back to Cincinnati. Cincinnati, you can see our own little Stonehenge here, and I'm pointing to it. And you can see this is roughly where Washington Park is today. And this was that great mound that you saw in the photo, in the painting from 1800. But let's lay this over the city grid for today. And the city grid today helps us make some UU connections. You can see here, this is the ellipse or the henge. And right behind it, where my cursor is the location of First Unitarian Church in 1830. This was our church until 1863. We were located there. Over here is the site of that great mound. And that great mound is also the location, and it's at 5th and Mound, is the location roughly of where W.H.G. Carter had his church of the Unitarian Brotherhood. It was almost identically at the same spot. Just a block north of that, at 6th and Mound Street, was the location of the Church of the Redeemer, which was the split-off church from ours in 1859. And First Unitarian and Church of the Redeemer used that church space until they could move up to across from City Hall here at 8th and Plum, and that is right here. And this is where the church was up until 1887 when we moved to our current location. So you can see there were mounds right there where City Hall was. There were mounds close to the 6th and Mound location, as well as to the location of Carter's church. So we have a connection geographically with this. Washington Park, where this W is in Washington Park, is the location of St. John's Unitarian Church before they moved up to Clifton. So again, there is an historic geographic connection. So back to that 1800 painting, you can see that this mound looks kind of flat on top, and that is because General Anthony Wayne in the 1790s decided he was going to take the top of that mound off, and he was going to make it a sentry post to guard the city from attack from the Shawnee, who were still occupying land west of the town. And the Shawnee were not happy with the fact that there was a settlement on their sacred land. So the sentry post there was to protect the city from Indian invasions. It was also the launching point for the war that occurred in the Ohio Valley between the indigenous people and the United States. Just a couple of years after Anthony Wayne lopped off the top of that mound, he fought a battle up in Maumee on the Maumee River called the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. He defeated a confederation of Indians that were the Miami, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Delaware, a number of other tribes from this area, the Ottawa. They all fought and they lost that battle. And so they signed a treaty in Greenville in 1795, and they divided Ohio in half. And they said that anybody north of the Greenville Treaty line would be living in Indian country. Anybody south would be called American territory. And so they ceded this land as a reserve for the American Indians, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Miami. The Miami also got Indiana. And Southern Ohio was safe from many more indigenous incursions into Cincinnati. And the rapid growth of Southern Ohio occurred as a result of this. But they were relocated. Now, at the end of the War of 1812, the British tried to negotiate a permanent settlement to make this a permanent country for Native Americans, to keep the United States away from Lake Erie and away from Canada, so that Indian country would become a buffer zone. And I realize I'm at a half hour and I'm almost finished here. So there was a buffer zone there. So they wrote in the Treaty of Ghent at the end of the War of 1812 that this land would be reserved for all of those tribes and all those nations of people north of that line. And for a few years, the United States followed that treaty with Great Britain. But by 1817, they decided they could no longer abide by this treaty line, and they came to all of these indigenous people and they told them that you're going to have to take smaller amounts of land for your reserves because we need this land here for development and settlers because they're coming in and we can't hold them back. And so in 1817, they made a treaty, and then following another treaty in 1818 that created these reserve areas for the Ottawa, the Wyandot, the Seneca, the Delaware, and the Shawnee. And so that existed for a period of time. And they also offered all of these nations land west of the Mississippi River, saying, if you would just move west of the Mississippi River, we would never bother you again. You could be there. They knew that at that point, that west of the Mississippi River was called the Great American Desert. And they never thought that Kansas Territory or Oklahoma Territory would be suited for settlers. And so they were offering all of that land west of the Mississippi River to these native nations. Slowly but surely, these native nations did migrate over there in a piecemeal fashion, but the largest number of them stayed behind. Now, the official policy of the United States was, we could deal with that, we can give them the choice, we can let them stay on their land. And they ultimately knew that the pressure from settlers coming into this territory would force them out. And so by 1831, 1 year after First Unitarian Church was founded, the move to force migrate all of these nations out started. And Andrew Jackson was the president, and he no longer accepted the fact that it was legitimate for any Indian nation to be east of the Mississippi River. He said, we own this land, they have no right to it, and we're going to force them out. And so began the period of Indian removal. There were a total of 8 removals, and this is the first one from 1831 to 1832. This one was an overland and a river route. This was called the Ohio Trail of Tears. 1832, there was another one that was an overland to Oklahoma and to Kansas. 1837 and 1839, there were 2 more removals. This one was all by water. And then in 1843, the last removal was the Wyandots. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that happened is that the Shawnee, the Wyandot, and the Ottawa all agreed to try to assimilate into American society and culture and be farmers just like everybody else. And in fact, they had the most manicured farms in northern Ohio. But racism intervened, and the settlers said, we will not tolerate having Indians with better farmland than ours. And that forced the hand of the US government and the US Army to force these people to be removed. They were ultimately removed to this territory. And you can see it's kind of a mishmash of carved out territories for each of the tribes. And it was west of Missouri, not only west of the Mississippi River, but west of the state of Missouri, because Missouri as a slaveholding state would not tolerate any native or indigenous people living in their boundaries. And so they were forced to go to Kansas, and we know what happened after the Civil War. They lost their lands again, and they were all squished down into Oklahoma and further west. Now, As a closing, I don't know if people ever saw this Mother Jones issue in December of 1980. This was Russell Means, who was one of the founders of the American Indian movement. And he said in this article, "For the world to live, Europe must die." And one of the quotes out of that article was, "The European materialist tradition of despiritualizing the universe is very similar to the mental process which goes into dehumanizing another person." And when he's talking about Europe and the European, that Europe must die, he's talking about the European ethos, the European worldview, the view that the world is for conquering and the world is for taking. And it's a very important lesson for those of us who want to keep one foot in the present world with an understanding of our past and our eyes on the future. Can we, as a future civilization, not take these comments to heart and realize that we are in a process that is destroying our ability to live on this planet, and that we've got a lot to learn from the indigenous people who came before us? And with that, I'm going to close out the presentation and entertain questions.
So Tim, so there are no designated Indian lands whatsoever in the state of Ohio.
There are a few tiny things that exist. Now, one of the things that's happening at this point in time is that the Shawnee are trying to buy land in Ohio. And they're trying to buy the land as incorporated Shawnee land so that it will become a reserve. And so there's no law that is stopping them from purchasing the land, but there's nothing that allows them to declare it as a reserve that is only for them. It's only their title to the land, their deed, that is allowing them to do what they want on the land. The current president, or the current chief of the Shawnee Nation, is a woman, and she is the first woman Shawnee chief in the history of the Shawnee. Her name is Dr. Glenna Wallace. And she sees herself as a guardian of the ancient sites in Ohio. And one of the things she's doing is she's raising money in her tribe so that they can buy land, and potentially buy land close to these old archaeological sites. Other questions?
Dan has a question.
Who?
Dan.
Oh, go ahead, Dan. Did you have a question?
Oh, he's kind of waving his hand around.
One side note about Glenna Wallace, she is an amazing person. When my students were doing a PBS story about the mounds of Ohio for a centennial of the American Park Service, I drove to Bloomington, Indiana, to the Bloomington Unitarian Universalist Church, and we met with Glenna Wallace in the church. And my students got to meet her. And she got to talk about how important this territory is for her people and her tribe, her nation. And it was really quite moving to hear her, because she was very articulate, very eloquent about what she saw as the role of her nation in trying to help the rest of this country think about how we should protect our natural resources and our historic resources. So it was what?
I do have a question when you're done.
Okay. Go ahead.
My family farmed in the area west of Wapakoneta, which is north of the Greenville Treaty Line.
Right.
And I'm told that they were there as early as the 1840s. When would that area would the Indians have been removed and would settlers have come in there approximately? Do you know?
1837 is when the Shawnee were removed from Wapakoneta.
Okay.
And Wapakoneta is a Shawnee name.
Right. I know. Yeah. Okay.
And as is Upper Sandusky.
Mhm.
Sandusky is actually a Wyandot name. And so a lot of that's the odd thing about this. We have kept the names of the ancients who lived here, but we no longer allowed them to live here. We let them leave their names behind.
So my people would have been the first ones there on that land, among the first.
They
Sounds
could have
like.
been among the first.
Yeah.
And
Okay. Thank you.
one of the reasons that the Shawnee and the Wyandot and the Ottawa, they chose the very best farmland they could when they negotiated these treaties.
Mhm.
And so when the settlers came in, they're saying, why do the Indians get all the good land?
Mhm.
And that was one of the impetuses to push them off their land.
Mhm.
And they had become well-to-do farmers. They
Mhm.
had well-manicured farms. They
Mhm.
had good income, but they were forced to lose all of that. And the Trail of Tears was just a bitter, bitter time, because as they left, they stopped along the way to say goodbye to all the people that they had made as friends, both European and native, when they left their territory. And they also did all of their religious rites and their dances.
Mhm.
They even, because they had developed a friendship with William Henry Harrison, when they were floating down the Ohio River, the boat stopped at North Bend, Ohio, and they all stood on the deck of the ships and they saluted and waved to the monument of William Henry Harrison. So there was this relationship. Go ahead.
So Tim, we have two virtual hands up, one from Dick and Carol Frankel, and then another from Helen. So Dick and Carol, why don't you go first? Oh, you're on mute.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little more, Tim, about the what groups have been working on uncovering the areas, Indian areas, the Native American areas in the Cincinnati area, downtown and out in Marymount. Is that from the university or from other places?
Well, the University of Cincinnati has done a lot of extensive work in Marymount. They also did a lot of extensive work in Fort Ancient. Unfortunately, because everything downtown in Cincinnati has been obliterated by development, by the street grid, there are no artifacts to find. Now, the Museum Center has that Cincinnati tablet, which, by the way, is only 5 inches. It's only the size of the palm of my hand. They have that, and they might have some other artifacts, but out of respect for indigenous people, they're not displaying it for people to see. The person that's responsible for preserving the information was Dr. Daniel Drake, the medical doctor who lived across the street from First Church on 4th Street in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. In fact, his brother, Benjamin Drake, wrote the first biography of Tecumseh, the chief of the Shawnee. And Tecumseh was quite a mythical figure because he came as close as anybody to creating a federation of native tribes that was going to create an Indian nation on the western boundary of the United States that would have prevented the westward flow of settlers. And he nearly succeeded in that. And he was an amazing leader. He spoke multiple languages, was fluent in English and French, as well as many of the indigenous languages.
Helen.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Helen.
Hi, Tim. So nice to be here. I was curious about the Hopewell because the neighborhood over from Titusville, where you and I met last time, is called Hopewell. And for you who don't know, that's in New Jersey. So I'm just curious. I honestly didn't know, or maybe there isn't. I assumed it was an English name.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I would love to know more.
there could be an ancient site that is dated to be part of the Hopewell culture. The name Hopewell comes from the farmer in Chillicothe who owned the land that Mound City was located on. And so they ended up naming the Hopewell culture after him because he owned the land. And
Wow.
he had farmed that land. And in fact, he had almost destroyed Mound City. They had to rebuild it. Archaeologists came back in and rebuilt it after they were able to buy it from him. But he had almost leveled it completely to plant crops on it because it was good bottom land, right next to the Scioto River. So Hopewell could have been tied to that culture, that they were able to date an earthwork in New Jersey related to it. And they would do that by the artifact similarity and other things.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to have to look into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For people who don't know, this is Helen Lundstrom Irwin, and Helen is the author of James's Journey, a novel about an abolitionist in Virginia who was also inherited a plantation. And she put Moncure Conway in her novel. And that's how we have developed a friendship, because she contacted our church after finding out that Moncure Conway was the minister of our church before the Civil War. She also has a second novel out called Sour Milk and Sheep's Wool, which is about the Swedish women's rights movement of the 19th and 20th century.
Oh, thank you, Tim. That was so nice.
I wanted to put that plug in. Anybody
Yeah,
wants to
thank
get the book, you can contact me.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I just see a note in here in the chat for anyone who might not see it. It's from Linnea Los. She says, Marymount opened the Native American Cultural and Education Center on September 4th, 2019, and is located on the second floor of the Municipal Building addition. It is open to the public Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., but call first to make sure it's open. And then she gives the number, which is 513-271-3246. Thank you, Linnea.
That's good information. I wanted to do a shout out to Ed Ryder, and because one of the books that I have on my shelf was a biography of Tenskwatawa, who was Tecumseh's brother. And in the acknowledgement page on that book, Ed Ryder gets acknowledged as a very helpful archivist that helped Dr. Edmonds put together this biography of Tenskwatawa. And this was when Ed was working at the Historical Society, and he helped Dr. Edmonds get a hold of important archive material at the Cincinnati Archives.
Wonderful.
Tim,
Yeah.
I have a question about Norwood, and there's the Indian Mound area of Norwood. Is there any research done on that?
As far as I know, it is either Hopewell or Fort Ancient age. It is not Adena. Adena is the most ancient, going back to 1000 BCE. But that Indian mound is more closely related to the Fort Ancient culture, I think, but it could have been a spillover between Hopewell and Fort Ancient. And I think if anybody wants to understand more about the Fort Ancient culture, it's a wonderful place to go for a day trip, because the museum there is quite extensive. And one of my good friends that I used to work with as a machinist, and he was a machinist in the same factory I was in 1980, left machining, became an archaeologist, and became the man who helped to reinterpret the importance of Fort Ancient. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. His name was Dr. Bob Conley, but he was a wonderful human being, and there are even pictures of him at that museum. but that sort of sparked my interest in doing this because Bob was such a good friend, and we went through a lot of things together as union activists in a machine shop.
Any last minute questions or comments? Oh, there's a question here in the chat. Any idea why the museum center hasn't returned the tablet to a tribe? Is it just not possible to identify which nation originally created it, so there's nobody to return it to?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that. Maybe you would know, Ed. Do you know about its existence and why?
He's shaking his head no.
Okay. I know that they're very concerned about cultural sensitivity, and it's the reason that they're not displaying it. But it could be that it would be hard to transfer it to someone. And I'm not sure that any culture has asked for it either. I don't know that the Shawnee have asked for it to be given to them. I don't think that that would have been in the Shawnee's interest at this point. Yeah, Jane.
Do you know what group is trying to buy lands in Ohio that if somebody wanted to contribute or whatever?
It's the Eastern Band of the Shawnee in Oklahoma, and that's Dr. Glenna Wallace's tribe. There is also a remnant band of Shawnee who are not officially recognized by, they're not officially recognized by the federal government, and they are not officially recognized by the Shawnee of Oklahoma or Kansas City. And they claim to be the descendants of Tecumseh who did not remove themselves. They went underground rather than being removed, and they assimilated into the culture, and they intermarried with Europeans, and so therefore wouldn't have any of the same bloodline connection to the Shawnee of the West, but they nonetheless still claim to be of Shawnee heritage. And they have a cultural center outside of Urbana, Ohio, north of Springfield. I attended a Shawnee Thanksgiving there once, and one of the great biographers of Tecumseh, his name, he was also a member of the Bloomington Unitarian Universalist Church. His name is James Alexander Tom, and he's married to Dark Rain Tom, who is the clan leader of the Turtle Clan of the Shawnee, but she is also a member of that remnant band, even though she is almost full-blood Shawnee. James Alexander Tom wrote a biography of Tecumseh, which is regarded as the best biography, called Panther in the Sky. He's also the biographer of the Clark family of Lewis and Clark fame, that biography called From Sea to Shining Sea. He also wrote a book called Follow the River. But he's an amazing historian, and has got one of the very best works on Tecumseh that you can find. The reason I was so interested in Tecumseh and the Shawnee myself was that I went to Tecumseh High School in Clark County, named after George Rogers Clark, near Springfield. And not once was Tecumseh's name ever mentioned in my high school curriculum. And I determined that I was going to learn as much as I could.
Linnea and Arcus, I see your hands. I just wanted to note, while we're on the subject, Tim, earlier when you were talking about the current leader of the Shawnee, Dr. Wallace, you said that she was articulate, and I just want to note that that's a microaggression against indigenous
Absolutely.
people.
I thought of that immediately when it came. My apologies. That's why I also added eloquent. But it is a microaggression, and I deeply regret having said that. But thank you for pointing it out. I appreciate that.
Linnea, I saw your hand first.
Tim, can you tell us what's going on out in Adams County at the Serpent Mound, where the citizens arrive to purge the demons from the mound or something, and it's still ongoing out there?
Right. Well, there is a fundamentalist religious group in Columbus, Ohio, that took it upon themselves to go to Serpent Mound because they interpreted the serpent of Serpent Mound to be the serpent of Satan. And they were going to purge the mound of its pagan heritage. And it's also been a gathering spot for a lot of New Age people. The New Age people have gone there on the solstices, and much to the anger of indigenous people, they were dancing on the serpent and lighting candles and doing things that would have been seen as disrespectful. And so there's been this controversy all along about who controls Serpent Mound and how should it be regarded and respected. And the American Indian activists in Ohio have been taking upon themselves to be guardians of that. Now, Chief Glenna Wallace has shown up at Serpent Mound on occasion with the leaders of the indigenous people in Southern Ohio to reclaim the property. It is owned by the Ohio Historical Society, or now called the Ohio History Connection, and they become the guardians of it. And there's a relationship between the Shawnee Nation and the Ohio History Connection, so that they're taking advice from the Shawnee as to how to take care of the property. And so now there are more regulations, but that fundamentalist group even came with shovels, and they were going to start digging up part of the mound and disinterring what they thought were the evil spirits. And Native American activists stopped them from doing that, but it was a major confrontation, and the fundamentalist group came with guns. This happened, I think, 2 years ago now.
My goodness. Arcus.
Hello. So since we're talking about acknowledgements, number one, I'm not sure what the sort of text of the acknowledgement and how it's presented, say, in your services are at First Church. I'd be interested in hearing that, but I have a couple of concerns about acknowledgements. For example, if you say, we are on the land of the Shawnee, or we're on land that belongs to the Shawnee, be aware of whose land this belongs to. If you drive up to my house and you say, hey, I took your car, I've got your car, the expectation is, okay, give me the keys. So the wording of it, if there's not an action that follows through on, okay, that it feels problematic. And I've seen an article that discusses especially young people, indigenous people's view of, some of them said, it's troubling to go places and hear really short blurbs, hi, this is whose land we're on, and just keep moving. And it's sort of a reminder, but without engagement. And can you address what the process was of discussing your church's land acknowledgement?
Well, I think this TAD Talk series that started in November is part of a process that we're engaged in to get a better understanding of what land acknowledgements are about, and also get a better understanding of the history of the land where we're living, and what was the indigenous history of the land where we're living. The land acknowledgement that Reverend Connie uses, I can't repeat it verbatim, but it makes mention of the fact that we are on land that the ancient mound builders, the Hopewell and the Adena people, as well as the Shawnee and the Miami once occupied. And I don't know the exact, I can't repeat the exact wording she uses, but it's done in a sense of reverence. And it's done in a sense of acknowledging that we are not a complete people without mentioning the fact that there were people before us. And I think that's part of the humility that needs to come with a land acknowledgement, is saying that, again, we're not self-made individuals or a self-made culture. We're a culture that has come to exist and benefited from the cultures that came before us. So I think that's the intention of a land acknowledgement. It's an intention to be humble about our presence on this earth, and an intention to be respectful about our presence on this earth. Does that help?
Yes, I mean, I recognize that it's a work in progress, is what I'm taking also. I did post to the chat the link to the article that I read recently where indigenous artists, mostly younger people, were talking about their feelings about sort of how acknowledgements can go wrong.
I really appreciate you bringing up that question, Arcus, and sharing this link, because land acknowledgements certainly can feel like virtue signaling, or lip service. And for anyone who might be watching this later, if you Google Vice, it's Vice News, and it's indigenous artists tell us what they think about land acknowledgements. You should be able to find it.
And there are a lot of opinions among indigenous people about this, and it runs the gamut, which is quite interesting. And I think that we need to be, if we choose to do a land acknowledgement, we need to be aware of that dialogue, because I think it's incumbent upon us to be aware of how indigenous people receive acknowledgements like that, and to know where that leads us. Because, like you said, it's a work in progress. And as members of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, we were always a work in progress, and that we need to remain open about those things.
Fair enough.
I can't think of any better words to go out on, y'all. We are always a work in progress. It's 8 o'clock. I do want to be respectful of your time. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Tim, for sharing your extensive knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Night.